This is Trevor Crow. Welcome back, Trevor and friends. I am on a Zoom call with Jason Rojas. He's the majority leader, the House Majority Leader. He's a Democrat. He's from District 9, and he's been very important in a whole bunch of super key bills. And where do we want to start? First of all, Jason, how did you get involved in politics to start with?
Yeah, it's a question. First of all, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity. I kind of somewhere around 9 or 10 years old, I was a kid who read a lot of newspapers. Still read a newspaper every day. But I remember thinking very on, like I wanted to be mayor of my hometown. So that was kind of like my basis. And then, when I got to high school, really got engaged in like community service and student government and other type of leadership club opportunities that presented itself. And I met my wife in high school, and she will tell you that I was a politician in high school. And what she meant by that is I was that person who seemed to know everybody or seemed to make a concerted effort to talk to everybody and want to make them feel like they're a part of our school community. So by the end of high school, I was president of the student body, this, that, and the other thing. And went to college, interestingly enough, did not do student government. Was an officer in my fraternity in college, which is a different kind of politics. But when I was done with college, I immediately just got involved and started volunteering on campaigns, got appointed to the Inland Wetlands Commission, Historic District Commission, ran for the school board, ran for the town council, seat opened up in the legislature. My mayor at the time thought I'd be pretty good at it. I was like, okay, I don't know. I'd never thought about the legislature. And now here I am 17 years later.
Unbelievable. Well, you've done so much for the state of Connecticut. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is this affordability crisis in the state. There's so
Yeah,
many great things that we are doing, but the affordability problem is a kind of across also socioeconomic places, right? We are
right.
seeing it's difficult to rent, to pay your electric bill, food prices, gas prices, it goes on and on. So talk
Right.
to me about what we're doing as a state, what we're doing as a Democratic Party to ameliorate some of those problems.
Yeah, and listen, I mean, these are challenges that as a state have been allowed to kind of fester and or develop over decades, right? This is not a new thing. I would suggest that there's bipartisan responsibility for where we are today, and there's certainly bipartisan accountability for helping to solve it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it's hard to remove politics from politics, but sometimes we need to just focus on the policy and set the politics aside so we can actually arrive at some solutions that really move the needle on a lot of these difficult questions. And part of the challenge that we face is that we are in politics, and some people who serve an elective office want to make a point about a policy question to score political points.
Right.
I get it, right? As opposed to try to put forward a policy solution and actually solve a problem. So, in my world, housing is a big component of the cost of living. Part of it is
Mm-hmm.
geography. Part of it is how old our state is. There's a lot of things that make it really that much more expensive to live in New England. It's not just unique to Connecticut. It's expensive to live in our entire region of the country. And there's some serious ramifications for that as we see some people continue or choose to move south because it's cheaper. It's largely driven, I think, by weather preferences, but certainly the economics of the region down south or out west are different than the economics of the Northeast. There's a trade-off
Mm-hmm.
to that when you move to those places. So when you talk about affordability, right, when it comes to, the electric bill that has really been politically salient for the last couple of years, right, we did make some changes in terms of how the public benefits charge is going to be handled
Mm-hmm. I
rather than
saw
it
that.
being, right, rather than it being on somebody's electric bill. We have determined that we're going to borrow some dollars to try to pay down that debt, knowing that we can get a lower interest rate than if the electric companies, our power companies, both Avangrid and or is it
Mm-hmm.
Avangrid, right? And
Eversource, yeah,
Eversource.
UI, yeah.
If they were to go out, I mean, again, those are all things that the consumer is legally obligated to pay for. When there's a giant storm and we have to clean up after that
Yeah.
storm and repair everything, Eversource, quote unquote, is not paying for that. Consumers are, right? So we know that if Eversource was going to recoup that money, which they're legally obligated to get back or able to get back, right? They would have had to
Mm-hmm.
borrow at a much higher rate than the state of Connecticut could.
And
So,
that is a very good thing to know. All right. So
right.
anybody listening right now, because I know I've heard this from friends and people in the state, and of course I've talked to Ryan Fazio about this, which
Yeah,
is it is a good idea. We can borrow at a less costly rate. So
right.
I'm so glad we did that. So it's fiscally responsible. Excellent. So let's talk about housing, because this is something that is a huge problem here in the Northeast. It is one of the biggest drivers for our unaffordability problem. And I know that you worked very hard, and I believe it was bipartisan or a little bit, tiny bit.
It's hard to call it bipartisan on this. We certainly engaged a lot of people on the questions, but it's part of the problem that we face. I think there is a bipartisan concern about housing affordability. There is more of a partisan approach to how we arrive at the solutions to it, and it's always a delicate balance in terms of, do we continue to allow the status quo to continue, right? Which is these decisions primarily being made at the local level. And I do believe these decisions should be primarily made at the local level, right?
Yep.
But housing questions are not just a Greenwich problem or an East Hartford problem or a Vernon problem, right? They're kind of a regional policy question that we should be thinking about it in that way. But I think for the average homeowner in particular, or the average renter, it is a very personal decision, and therefore they would prefer, I think, naturally and rationally, that those decisions be made at the local level, because they're worried about what the impact of a decision might be on what is the biggest investment that they will ever make, right? The investment in their home. So I totally, yeah, go ahead.
I'm gonna like do a little 10,000, bring up the helicopter a little bit from, just the local level, which I agree. And I read a very interesting op-ed by Tim Fisher, Dean of Yale Law School, talking about why housing is so important. And it's not just from an economic standpoint, because it's a very important part of the economic standpoint, but there's a moral sort of thought process behind this as well. Can you talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's actually what brought me to the topic of housing when I began kind of my interest, right? When you get to the legislature, obviously you're confronted with every policy issue that we deal with. Generally speaking, a lot of legislatures will find a lane and become an expert in something or put a lot of their time into it. I chose housing, and it really went back to this question of, racial and economic segregation. That's really what launched me into this. And I'm a student of history, a student of the civil rights movement, and trying to understand, like, are we now in a place in our society where we're okay with segregation? Because in many ways, our schools are more segregated today than they were 50 years ago, right? And I don't know that most people really appreciate that. And what are the moral implications of continuing to be indifferent to that level of segregation? I actually think it has ramifications for kind of the broader societal challenges that we're facing right now, right? Kind of the
absolutely,
separating, kind of coming apart at the seams. I think part of that has to do that we don't really understand each other as human beings when it comes to issues of race and class. Because we largely don't live near each other. We don't have a shared lived experience. Our kids don't go to the same schools. Our kids don't play in the same Little League teams. We certainly don't even worship on Sundays, right? Those places are pretty segregated themselves too. And that really comes down to housing policy. If you look at the history of it, right? That's not me making a political statement. If you look at the history of these questions, government explicitly and intentionally enacted policies that prevented people from being able to live with each other, or certain groups of people from being able to access housing or home ownership, from being able to access particular communities, from being able to access even neighborhoods. And that has ramifications for all of us. So that's the moral question of it. But then there's also the economic one. When you concentrate poverty, and there is some correlation between race and economics, but there are plenty of poor white individuals in Eastern Connecticut who are suffering from the same lack of opportunities to access to opportunity. When you concentrate poverty, that manifests itself in all sorts of other public policy challenges that we all know too well: struggling schools, public safety, economic development, home ownership rates. And what happens when we allow those things to continue? We all end up paying for that by having to provide additional resources to try to solve the challenges that are created by racial and economic segregation. We all pay a premium to help solve those issues when we have to invest more money in education for certain school districts because they're high poverty, when we have to put more into our healthcare system to meet the needs of individuals who lack access to healthcare or even lack access to a healthcare provider, right? We all have to pay for that. So there's both the moral and the economic implications.
Absolutely. These are important questions, and I'm not sure everybody's really thinking about them. And today, especially in this moment where every DEI initiative is being deconstructed, and we're all looking at this very differently. And we have ICE who are taking people right off the streets without due process. So there's a lot in here. And again, I'm not sure everybody truly understands. There's a cost and a loss for every one of us when we don't have all of us educated together, playing sports together, worshiping together, knowing each other. Because when we have that sense of community and knowing and understanding, we get away from that them, they, where we don't know them. We're dehumanizing that group of people. And
Right.
when we dehumanize, we get to places like we saw in Germany in the 30s and 40s. And we sure as heck don't want that to happen here in the United States. So talk to me about the bill that you introduced that got vetoed by Governor Ned Lamont. Talk to me about what was in that, why did he veto it, and why, and what are we going to solve in a special session?
Yeah, I mean, well, there, it was a multifaceted bill. It had a number of initiatives to try to help towns, right, arrive at a goal that they all purport to have, right? I think you go across the state, every town says we believe in affordable housing. We believe there's a need for affordable housing. And what we were trying to do, we're trying to provide some more tools and resources to help towns get there. I think it got painted into something else that it wasn't, particularly around the fair share question. Right. So fair share is a policy question we've been considering for at least the last 6 or 7 years. It's based on a model in New Jersey. The case in New Jersey was a little bit different than Connecticut because that was brought about through a legal. The court said that towns had to do a fair share or had to participate in a fair share plan for every town to host different types of housing, a diversity of housing, including affordable. We had a needs assessment that was done over the last 18 months. The consultant who did that needs assessment, again, it was a consultant that was hired by the state of Connecticut, paid with public resources to come up with this outcome. And they ended up with a number of units, about 100,000 units that they believe and that we believe and lots of others believe is really needed to meet the needs of individuals who are kind of 0 to 80% of area median income. That area median income really being dependent on where you live. So 50% of AMI in Fairfield County is a very different number than 50% of AMI in, say, Northeast Connecticut. So it's really, and that bolsters my argument about housing is a regional issue, not just a town by town issue. Although it's fair to look at it from a town by town basis. And what it did was it looked at that 100,000 units and kind of distributed them by region. And then from region, it distributed them to each of our communities. And what we were asking towns to do is when you do your next affordable housing plan beginning in 2027, use that number to inform your plan. Because right now, the quality of affordable housing plans has been uneven. Some towns did a really good job. Westport has a really good affordable housing plan. And there are some other towns who I'm not going to name who don't look like they really put a whole ton of effort or thought into it. And what we were trying to do, and it's not the town's fault, when we require towns to develop these affordable housing plans, we didn't put a lot of parameters about what it is they should be looking for, what should they be thinking about, what's the outcome that we would like to see. So what we did was say, hey, use this number that was done by an objective needs assessment and use that to inform your thinking about how you want to change zoning and how you're going to change zoning, right, to allow different kinds of housing to be developed within your community. Because right now, 90% of the land in Connecticut is zoned for single family. So when you want to even do a 2-family home or a 3-family home, you got to go get a variance or go through this process of getting an exception. And each of those steps in the land use process adds to the cost of housing. And again, I think that's another thing that most people don't really think about, but it's our responsibility as policymakers to think about it.
So what do you think? And I'm unsure. What was the sticking point for Governor Lamont? Why did he veto this? And what would you like to see changed?
Yeah, based on his comments, right, he heard a lot of concerns from locally elected officials that we were mandating towns to do X or Y, right? And it just was not accurate. I think the governor wanted to take a step back based on the feedback that he was hearing from people. And knowing that we have an opportunity for a reset, he decided to veto the bill. I think the bill could have been signed and we could have had a commitment to make those adjustments. But I think that really speaks to the political nature of this. I don't know how serious people are about actually solving the housing issue. And this is where it does become partisan. Sure, there are Democrats who voted against the bill, but most of the rancor was really created by partisans from the Republican Party who say they're committed to housing and committed to affordable housing, but oppose everything we try to do, and quite frankly, don't actually propose anything to actually move the needle on this. So when they say they don't have a seat at the table, they don't have any solutions, right? I'm open. I think most people know me as being somebody who you can pick up the phone and call, and I'm going to meet with you. I don't really care what your party is. But that's not what we're getting from the other side of the aisle. They created a lot of noise, particularly on social media, particularly with a group that's active in Fairfield County, CT 169, right, who put out a lot of misinformation or or their opinions about a bill, which are fine, right? But I don't know that other duly elected officials should really be basing their decisions on what some anonymous social media group is saying on Facebook. That doesn't really seem like a good way to formulate public policy.
I agree with you. And again, kind of circling back to what we need. I mean, whether it's an economic, we need 100,000 units. We have an unaffordable living situation. We have a less than 2% vacancy rate in the state of Connecticut. We cannot grow. And when we talk about affordable housing, some people are like, oh my gosh, well, affordable housing means that's for somebody who makes 80,000 or 60 or 100,000, even in Greenwich, right here. So it's hard to afford. You can't afford to live in Greenwich if you're making $80,000. And that would be somebody who might be a teacher, EMS worker, and all of these people who are here to help us and are part of our communities, and they cannot afford to live it here.
Well, and when somebody can't live in your community, you know what that ends up meaning? That ends up meaning a teacher has to live 20 miles away and takes up time on I-95, and then people complain about traffic, right? I mean, so it's really multifaceted. And then you think about the environmental impact of all those cars on 95, congestion, lost productivity, all of it comes together, and housing is really at the nexus of all those questions.
It's so important. Just if anybody's tuning in right now, this is Trevor Pro. The show is Trevor and Friends. We are on WGCH. I am on with Jason Rojas, our House Majority Leader. He's District 9. He's been in there for 17, did you say so? In politics for 17 years. And we are discussing a very, very important bill that got vetoed by the governor. It's regarding housing. I think its kind of big name was Fair Share, but there's other names in it.
Right.
And what I went and started reading about what other states are doing. So New Hampshire is trying to ameliorate some of their problems, like they're allowing more ADUs, accessory dwelling units. Is that part of this bill? There's one parking space per housing unit now. There's a bunch of things we can do to create a better usage of our space.
Right, and that's what this bill was attempting to do. ADUs was something that we tackled back in 2023. But even then, right, to get it through the legislature, we had to allow for an opt-out. And when you allow for an opt-out, guess what towns do? They opt out, right? And some towns opted out of the state law and created their own, which is great. But I think a lot of the policies that are currently in place are making it difficult for people to actually utilize or benefit from creating an accessory dwelling unit on their property. There was a focus here on parking and trying to reduce the amount of parking that is required by towns when somebody comes forward with a project. We already know there's too much parking across the state. That's an inefficient use of land that has environmental impacts. And depending on the type of unit, it could add $30,000 to $40,000 per space to the cost of a development, right? And if you're near a train station, you probably don't need as much parking as you otherwise would need if you weren't near a train station, or if you're on a bus line, right? Or allow the marketplace to kind of make a determination about how much parking is actually needed. I think a prospective renter who's going to an apartment is going to go there and realize they don't have parking, but they have a car. It's likely they're not going to rent an apartment there. That obviously poses a different kind of challenge. But what we're trying to do is solve for a number of things. And again, housing is at the nexus of it. So you pointed out New Hampshire, North Carolina a couple of weeks ago abolished minimum parking requirements, 107 to nothing. 107 to nothing in their
That's
house.
amazing.
Republicans and Democrats both voted for that. And there, Boulder, Colorado has moved in the direction of abolishing parking minimums. So yes, this is a dramatic policy change, I think, as a state and as people who have grown up in a car-centric society. But we really need to change the thinking, and that begins with policy and trying to give more tools and opportunities for the development community. And everybody wants to vilify them. I don't know who else you think is going to build housing other than developers. But unfortunately, the political narrative right now is
need those developers.
They want to make every developer some evil operator. And yes, there are bad actors, but I think there are far more good actors on this who actually want to provide homes for people, whether it's ownership or renter. We want to give people choice, and we don't want to force anybody to do one thing or another. And keep in mind, the bill was going to continue to allow local control. Most of these, almost all the decisions were going to continue to be made at the local level. The state does have the legal authority It's state statute that empowers planning and zoning commissions to actually do the work that they do. What the state does under Section 8-2 of the state statutes, it sets the parameters for how planning and zoning, and that's current law. That's not new. So what we were doing was making changes to that area to kind of set the parameters for how towns have to do their zoning regulations. But at the end of the day, the decisions would continue to be made at the local level and not in Hartford and not at the Office of Policy and Management. What we're trying to do is put more resources there to actually help towns and cities arrive at their goals, which is something I've been hearing about for a long time. And this bill included that too. This bill included an investment in public housing, right? So many of our communities have public housing authorities. Greenwich has one, Westport, Fairfield share one. They have a great one. What this was going to do was provide more resources to them to provide more deeply affordable housing at the local level. And here's the thing about housing authorities. They are governed locally. Their governing bodies are people who live in their communities. So you can't tell me that we were trying to take away local control when the opposite is actually true. We were actually investing more in local control. But for political reasons, people made a different argument.
I am so glad to hear this from you, Jason. And again, anybody listening, Greenwich residents, this is a bill that was not set out to take away local control. And that is just a overall insane thing that, and in fact, last election in the municipals, we had these little signs around town saying no high rises. So it's a part of the way the right is trying to drum up fear and upset, when actually this could solve a lot of problems. And I like less parking. We could get more people on the train. I'm going to get on the train this evening to go see Chicago at the Hartford Amphitheater up in Bridgeport. And that's because I don't want to drive. It's terrible traffic. So we need to use our trains better. I think we could do a little better on our scheduling. Can you work on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, frequency. And to your point, I don't want high rises in anybody's neighborhood. There are some parts of the state where a high rise might be appropriate. That's not what this bill is about. So the graphics and the mailers that are put out there are intended to scare people into really voting or advocating against their own interests. Because I think, and particularly in Fairfield County, far too many families are housing cost burden. And we often use a federal standard for affordability, which says we don't want anybody paying more than 30% of their income just towards housing. That's what we're trying to solve for. And I know how big of an issue it is down in Fairfield County. And I think people want to paint me from Hartford as wanting to do something. No, Fairfield County is a great place to live. Amazing communities, amazing quality of life, great education, great economic opportunity. I want to connect people to all those great things and not take anything away from anybody.
I love hearing that. And again, I feel like we've got this big thought process out there about government's bad. It's all corrupt. Everybody in the government is setting out to make your life miserable and to enrich themselves. And right, Jason, the people that I've met along the way that I got to, as I was running for state senate, I met you. I met an amazing amount of really caring, hardworking people who don't get paid very much, by the way.
No, I have a great full-time job, right? I was driven to, political office by how I started. I wanted to serve my community, and now I have the opportunity to serve my state. And in so much as I am a legislator who represents East Hartford and Manchester, I remind everyone that I'm a statewide policymaker, and my responsibility is to Greenwich and Westport and Fairfield, as much as it's to East Hartford and Manchester as well. And I think more legislators need to think that way.
Yeah, and I like that. And I think it's truly important. And we are a state. We're not just one county. We're not one town. And we really do need to be thinking about the overall long-term picture. And we do have to make some changes here. And I get it. Change is not what everybody wants. I know people are like, please, I want to go back to the 1950s. Not going to happen. It's just not. So we need to do this in a thoughtful, mindful way to allow for people to, whether it's build ADUs. What did we decide in Greenwich? I can't remember if we opted in or out.
Yeah, just again, I don't want to make assumptions, but thinking about the politics of that community, I would guess that you opted out.
We might have opted out. I have to go look that up. And then just having this idea that this bill actually adds more money into the public housing sector, and we have a very strong public housing group right here.
You have a great housing authority.
Hard work. Sam Romeo and his group, and they're updating and upgrading, and I think we're building some more in King Street area. So this is a bill that everybody benefits from. So what do you think Governor Lamont is looking for to tweak this so he can feel comfortable with signing it?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into the details of negotiation, right, is providing some greater clarity around the fair share question, right, and the number of units that we're asking communities to plan for, I think is one of the areas that we continue to discuss. And then to get us some greater clarity around parking, right, I think there are some individual parts of communities who are concerned about, again, this is a completely new idea, and people, I think, their imaginations run wild when we say you can't require parking anymore. That doesn't mean that a developer isn't going to have parking, right? Because even a developer making a significant investment in anything is going to realize I'm not going to be able to rent my apartment if there's zero parking.
No parking.
But I think they'll make a determination about that based on what they see on the ground when they actually go to build. Right. So I think it's bringing a bit more rationality to that question. On the commercial side of thing, there are examples where one town, if you have a bowling alley, requires 8 spaces per lane. Then there's another community that's only 5 spaces per lane. Some people base parking requirements on the square footage of a building, whether it's a particular kind of retail. And then, of course, on the housing front, it's based on bedrooms. At least the minimum is if it's a 1-bedroom or a studio, you have to have 1 spot. If there's 2 bedrooms or more, you have to have 2 spots. And in some situations, we'll have an apartment with 2 bedrooms and 2 individuals who have 2 cars, and sometimes we'll have 1, right? But allow the folks who have access to the information, who know exactly what they're doing on a day-to-day basis, actually arrive to a conclusion about how much parking makes sense for that particular development based on other things that are happening around it.
So this is another local control issue. I've just got a couple more minutes, but I recall reading an article, I think about a year and a half or 2 years ago, of in the United States, we have so much parking, much more parking than we actually have living units. It's such an irresponsible use of land, and it's also bad for the environment, right? So you can't, none of the moisture goes into the soil.
That's right. More impervious surface, more runoff we have into our streams. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's so many good things that we can be doing. Sort of kind of wrapping this up a little bit. I've been on with Jason Rojas. He's the House Majority Leader. He's been talking to us about the fair share law. Really grateful. Thank you, Jason, for being on the show with us. You get to come back after the special session and have further talks. And
I'm happy to come back anytime and talk to him, so your listeners can get an understanding of who I am and what my intentions are. And I'm not alone in this. There's a lot of great people on the Republican side too who really want to solve this issue. I think we all need a little bit more courage to actually get there.
Great message. All right, everybody, have a really wonderful rest of your day. Stay hydrated, stay cool, and talk to you next week. Bye.
You want to be able to see to him?
I good?
Here we are. Thank you.
Absolutely. That half hour flies by, I tell you.
It goes really quick, doesn't it?
Oh, smokes. Yeah, and it's such a big issue. It's hard to, and I tend to get all wonky and talk probably over talk as well anyway. But
it was good. It was good. I think you calmed a lot of fears, clarified some of the concerns. This is such an important issue for everybody and everything everywhere.
Yeah.
As someone who has to move in the next couple months,
Lisa's trying
I can attest.
It's really hard to find housing.
Good luck finding somewhere to move, right? I mean,
that's affordable.
Yeah, right. 1, can you find it? 2, can you afford it? And the chances are, if you're living down in your area, I feel bad for you. I feel bad sometimes for folks who live down there. I have a lot of friends from college, like my 2,500 square foot colonial would be like $1 million down in your area. I don't know how people afford to live. Yeah.
And when your job is connected, my husband commutes into the city, so we have to have something down here.
Right.
It's tricky.
Well, Jason, thank you for all you're doing. Public service. We appreciate you, and have to come back on the show, and we'll have more to discuss. Okay.
Yeah, happy to come on whenever you need me to opine on something. So yeah.
Awesome. If you want to, we're going to be post this on YouTube. If you want to take any of it and put it in your
we'll reshare the whole thing. Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you.
All righty.
Bye.